Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Paul Golin. I'm Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and Jews for a Secular Democracy is our pluralistic social justice initiative addressing church-state separation issues through diverse Jewish perspectives. And I'm joined today by Laura Rodriguez, who is our Jews for Secular Democracy Florida organizer. And tonight's program is called From Florida to the Nation, Amanda Tyler on Christian nationalism and religious freedom. So welcome to Amanda. I'm going to read Amanda's bio in a moment, and we'll get right into the questions. But first, just a tiny bit of housekeeping. You as participants, this is a webinar, so we won't see your video, but you're welcome to ask your questions in the chat or to put it in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we possibly can. And I also want to thank all of our sponsors, and we had a number of sponsors, so I'll try to be quick, but most importantly, we want to thank the Eula, May, and John Baugh Foundation for their support. We are also co-sponsored by the National Council of Jewish Women Miami, Florida Now, Keshet, Congregation Beth Adam, South Florida, Temple Israel of Orlando, the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and Or Adam Congregation in Phoenix. So Amanda Tyler is Executive Director of Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, leading the organization as it upholds the historic Baptist principle of religious liberty, defending the free exercise of religion and protecting against its establishment by government. The author of How to End Christian Nationalism, Tyler is also the co-host of BJC's Respecting Religion podcast. Tyler's constitutional law analysis and advocacy for faith freedom for all have been featured by major news outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, CBS News, ABC News, CNN, and MSNBC, and she has testified before Congress on religious liberty and Christian nationalism. A graduate of Georgetown University and the University of Texas School of Law, she lives in Dallas with her husband and son. So first of all, thank you so much for being here and welcome. And let me just jump right in with the first question, which is how do you define Christian nationalism and how does it threaten religious freedom?
Yeah, well, I am just so pleased to be here and loving seeing where everyone is joining from tonight. It's really wonderful to be in this virtual space and be able to have a national conversation about something that is really a national issue. So, in my book and in the work that I do around working to dismantle Christian nationalism, I define it this way: that Christian nationalism is a political ideology and a cultural framework that seeks to merge American and Christian identities into one. And I like to think about it in a larger frame as a particular kind of religious nationalism. Religious nationalism being this merger of political and religious identities and goals, and a religious nationalism that's been a recurrent problem throughout history and around the world today. When we're talking about Christian nationalism in particular, I think that we can date it back to at least the time of Constantine. That's when, the power of the Roman Empire assumed Christianity more or less as an official religion, and then used the force of the empire, including violence, to enforce Christianity and to push it on to its subjects. And that was, from a Christian perspective, where Christianity really started to diverge and become a religion of empire and not the religion that Jesus taught in the Gospels. But in the American context, so, I think it's important to note that we're not the only country that experiences Christian nationalism, but that there is a unique feature of American Christian nationalism. And that's really goes back to the founding of the country and even before the founding, that the roots of Christian nationalism were found in the doctrine of discovery. That's the deadly heresy that it was God's will for European conquerors to seize native lands and to enslave Africans and others in chattel slavery, and that was a distortion of the Gospels, trying to and the Scriptures, trying to justify their actions of conquest and oppression by saying that it was dictated and indeed blessed by religion. And there are certain markers of Christian nationalism in the American context that I think helps us identify it when we see it. One is a heavy reliance on a mythological history of the United States as a quote unquote Christian nation, not in a descriptive sense, but in a proscriptive sense, in the sense, again, a false history that says that the country was founded by Christians in order to privilege Christianity in law and policy. The problem, of course, with this false narrative is it is easily contradicted by constitutional history and, in fact, the constitutional text itself. The constitutional text that prohibited religious tests for public office from the beginning, and then since the time of the Bill of Rights, also provided for this extra protection for religious freedom, a religious freedom that is protected by an institutional separation of church and state, something I know this organization really strives to uphold. One that says that we value religion and religious pluralism in this country by making sure that the government is not in charge of either promoting or denigrating religion, and that is the only way that we can truly have a free exercise of religion in this country. I kind of boil down that constitutional promise into a promise of belonging, a promise that all belong in American society, regardless of how one identifies religiously, how one chooses to worship or chooses not to worship. That those are matters of free choice and individual choice and should not dictate one's level of belonging in the country. But Christian nationalism, this idea that to be truly American, that one has to claim a Christian identity to truly belong, that is both directly at odds with this constitutional promise of religious freedom for all, but also an urgent threat to belonging and indeed to safety for millions of Americans who fall outside of this very narrow circle of belonging that the ideology of Christian nationalism tries to draw.
Thank you, Amanda. I like the way that you really split that up. And I recently went to the Festival of Faiths in Kentucky, and the theme of the whole conference was sacred belonging. So when you refer to the word of belong, and that's what the whole conference was about. It was about belonging in different spheres. But one, of course, was belonging in the United States and being accepted, no matter what you believe. In your book, How to End Christian Nationalism, you lay out specific steps to counter it. Can you describe some of them?
Yeah, so a little bit about the book and kind of where it came from. At the organization that I lead, Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, we have been all about working to defend and extend religious freedom for all people now for nearly 90 years. And it was in 2019 when we first really started working in a concerted way to call out and identify Christian nationalism as an urgent threat to religious freedom, that we could not accomplish our mission of really having faith freedom for all as long as Christian nationalism exists and indeed is growing in the country. And so we thought it was important to name and identify the threat of Christian nationalism. And it was early on in this project when it was actually some of our interfaith partners, specifically Jewish partners and Muslim partners and Sikh partners and Hindu partners who said to us, you know, we agree with you that this is an urgent threat to belonging and to safety and to pluralism and to pluralistic democracy. But we really think it is on Christians to lead this cause. And that was for a number of reasons, but one of them is that it is Christians who can speak with the most level of authenticity about how Christian nationalism is an urgent threat, not just to pluralistic democracy, but also to an authentic expression of Christianity. That was something that was really, a Christian problem. It's kind of how they said it very kindly to us, but something that we really needed to head on. So when I went about writing this book, which came out a year ago in 2024, I had to think very early on about who my audience was. And early, my first thought was, well, I would like everyone to read this book, but that's not, when you're writing, you really need to think specifically. And so my particular audience was to a Christian audience, and particularly to a white Christian audience, and how they could, people who felt, I think, a yearning or a calling to take on Christian nationalism. I mean, that's really my audience, but how to take what is a huge problem and make it more manageable. Because I think sometimes I've been speaking on this issue for many years, and a lot of the response I would get is like, I know it's a problem, I don't know where to begin. And so the book is written in steps and really urges people to take it into more discrete and bite-sized places and to have conversations with one another about how they could connect in a community to take on some of these larger issues. And so for the first step in the book is just to name and understand the threat of Christian nationalism, some of where we started tonight, providing some definitions, but also providing some context about how prevalent this ideology is in the United States. And one of those ideas is, I think there's a tendency, especially over the last few years when the term Christian nationalism has become more widely accepted, to point to the most extreme examples of Christian nationalism. And we could talk about some of those really extreme examples, but to think that that's really all we need to concentrate on. And part of what I'm trying to do, particularly again for this white Christian audience, is to understand how we have, just by our own complacency, by our own privilege, by a lot of the ways that we have benefited in ways from the presence of Christian nationalism and Christian supremacy, that we have let it fester and grow in our own communities. And that it really is incumbent to understand how commonplace it is in our society if we're really going to take it on. Step two is really a calling, again, to all people of faith, but particularly to Christians, to really ground ourselves in our sacred tradition and understand the heart of Christianity is an expression of God's love for the world and for all people, regardless of difference. And in fact, that God loves the diversity of God's creation, and that should inspire the work that we have to understand the difference between Christianity and Christian nationalism. Some of the other steps are to really denounce violence, to commit to the separation of church and state. And then the second half of the book, the steps are really about taking action, whether that be through having tough conversations in our religious communities and in our families and our other friend groups, to organize for change, and then also to take our place in the public square, to engage in public advocacy on this topic. And I give some examples of where I've seen this done well, some suggestions on how to do this work, and then some questions for reflection for communities to discern how these ideas might be speaking to them in their particular lives about what the next steps they can take in order to make a difference. I'm really clear-eyed in the book about both the enormity of the problem and also realistic that even if all of us, committed to take on this change, that it probably is not going to be solved in any of our lifetimes. That this ideology that has been growing and has largely gone unaddressed for centuries will take a long time to dismantle. But that should not prevent us from taking the steps that we need to now in order to, it's not even about preserving what we have, because I think my argument in the book is even though we have the constitutional scaffolding that I think is at least a minimum that's required for religious freedom, that we've never had that full religious freedom, that full sense of belonging for a pluralistic society in this country. And that is what I think a pluralistic, diverse coalition of groups needs to come together in order to create for generations to come. And so, in the end, it's really a hopeful project. It's one that I do believe that change is possible, but we will need to have a large and diverse coalition of people who are committed to making some tough decisions, and particularly for white Christians willing to risk, some of their areas of privilege and that they have grown accustomed to because of white Christian nationalism, be willing to take that on and to work and be led by groups that have been historically oppressed and marginalized in order to make the difference that we need to see.
Yeah, I found it really powerful in that chapter on the first step, where you describe hearing from other religious groups about the hesitancy to call out Christian nationalism or to name it. And when we launched Jews for Secular Democracy in 2019, before we did, I remember doing a Google search of the Jewish Forward newspaper's website to find the phrase Christian nationalism, and I found maybe 5 references total. And this was already into 2019. So, I felt as well this real hesitancy. And even today, when we do programming, we're always quick to point out we're not talking about all Christians. We're not even necessarily talking about, um, a majority of Christians. So it is very challenging for us as a very small minority in America to speak about anything Christian at all, really, without feeling concern. I will say that I recently redid that search on the Forward's website, and there are hundreds now of references to Christian nationalism. So the ability, and I think I don't know that cover is the right word necessarily, but as you're describing, the fact that it's Christians who are speaking out against it has allowed, I think, certainly the Jewish community to have a more open conversation about it. So I wanted to get into a little bit about the initiative you founded, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, and to hear about what are some of the activities, why was it important for it to be, well, you kind of touched on why it was important to be a specifically Christian initiative, but what are you actually doing with this initiative?
Yeah, and it's interesting you did this search with the Forward. I've actually been interviewed a couple of times by by some
Right.
of the reporters at the Forward, and as well as a lot of different journalists on this topic, and I do think it is the responsibility of Christians to explain it, and also, I can say, and I do say to Christian audiences in a lot of places, because of the history of American Christianity and how it has largely come out of European Christianity, that our religion has been polluted by Christian nationalism for centuries. And so it really is on all of us who practice the religion today to interrogate where our own liturgies and theologies and worship practices and ways of being have been influenced. And that is, I think really only practicing Christians can speak that to other Christian audiences and issue that challenge. Just like I wouldn't presume to speak on Jewish nationalism, for instance, in different spaces, because that isn't my tradition. I can't speak as authentically on those topics as others could. So Christians Against Christian Nationalism, why 2019? It's not like it was new in 2019. It had been around. It's a very old ideology that's had presence in a lot of different parts of American history. And I've come to think of it as high tides of Christian nationalism. And some of the other high tides were certainly in the 1950s, at the kind of the height of the Red Scare and the way that the Christian religion was used. That's where we had, under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance, and in God we trust became a national motto. Um, Earlier in the 20th century, kind of the height of the KKK, and that being an example of white Christian nationalism, a particularly stark, violent, deadly example. In the 1910s and 20s, KKK was a mainstream organization in this country, millions of members. Can look back at the Civil War. Anytime that groups, even well-meaning groups at times, try to claim God for their side and use the language of Christianity in order to justify national policy or to draw lines of inclusion and exclusion. Those are all examples from our past of Christian nationalism. But in 2019, we really came off of a series of increasingly violent and deadly attacks, specifically in houses of worship, and in and around houses of worship. And that the perpetrators of those attacks were armed not just with deadly weapons, but with this deadly ideology. And I'm thinking and naming in particular the shooting at Mother Emanuel AME Church, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, and the attacks and threats made to synagogues in Charlottesville, and then, of course, the Tree of Life synagogue shooting. And so, because of the urgent threat, again, to religious freedom, and even that most basic freedom to be able to worship in our houses of worship without the fear of being killed because of our religion, and religious and racial identity, which happened in all of those spaces, that we really felt a need to both name Christian nationalism and to give tools, particularly to Christians, to take it on. And so, what started in the summer of 2019 as a statement of principles, a statement of unifying principles that we felt would unite a broad diversity of Christians across many different expressions. And in fact, it did. In the early days, we had our early count was we had over 6 dozen different kinds of Christians who had signed on to this statement of principles. These are Christians who disagree about all kinds of theological matters, but could be united in denouncing Christian nationalism. And so for several months, when you start things like this, you don't really know where they will go. And so for several months, that we kept this initiative going. And then January 6th, 2021 happened, and we saw there very clear expressions of Christian nationalism, how the ideology, the language, the worship songs even were used to bring together all these different groups who converged on the Capitol in an attempt to overthrow the results of the 2020 election, but used the language of Christian nationalism to unite them and to try to justify their unjustifiable attacks and violence, saying that their work was condoned and blessed by God. And so it was then that the campaign and the initiative really provided, I think some very important resources for people to help understand what was happening. Just a few weeks after January 6th, our campaign hosted a live webinar, kind of like this, where we had Bishop Michael Curry of the Episcopal Church and Bishop Elizabeth Eaton of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, as well as Andrew Whitehead, a sociologist who's an expert, to have a conversation. And we had over 10,000 people join us live for that webinar, which I think was just an expression of how much people needed to understand what was happening. And so our campaign really provided a lot of resources to Christian audiences, but to a large audiences to just help understand what was happening in our country. And then a little over a year ago, we really started redirecting many of our resources, not just in providing public information like we're doing here tonight, but also to help train and resource people on the ground who are interested in doing local organizing. And so what started with a single pilot project in North Texas, which is where I live now, has expanded now to over 20 different local organizing projects that we have going and that we continue to grow. And these groups are coming together in their local communities using the resources that we provide, as well as some training and cohorts that we're designing to try to help them design and determine what they might be able to do in their local communities to take on Christian nationalism. So that's where we are, now 6.5 years and counting into this project. And we will see kind of where this continues to grow. But particularly in the past year, we've had even more interest from groups wanting to take this on, both with the book coming out, but also with the political situation, such as it is. A lot of people are coming out and saying, what can I do? And we're just trying to resource people with some of these different avenues of places that they can plug into the work.
Thanks, Amanda. I'm hoping that we can do some of the organizing here in Florida,
Yes.
because we definitely need boots on the ground here. So we have a grant-based initiative here in Florida. Um, Many of us advocates see our religious freedom under attack in many, many ways, um, from our government, etc. We even have our legislature has its own national prayer breakfast, if you want to call it that, which I have heard some people attend and they've decided to actually walk out because they couldn't stand what they were hearing. What's your take on Christian nationalism in Florida? And what can we do here in Florida when we care so much about this separation to defend religious freedom and maybe try to quell the spread out of Florida?
Yeah. Well, there's good news and challenging news, I guess. I mean, the challenging news is just the reality. And I live in Texas, and I think often you can look at what's happening in Texas and Florida in a real mirror image kind of way, as far as sometimes things start in Florida and come to Texas, and sometimes things start in Texas and go to Florida. But I've taken to saying, to live in Texas now is kind of to live with two levels of authoritarianism, what we see in the national, but also what we're growing to see from a state level, that the policies that are coming out of the state capitol are so much more extreme than what the everyday Texan, even in a red state. I think that's something that I try to tell people that policies are so much more extreme than what Republicans in Texas voters want. But because of political gerrymandering, because of enormous infusion of money that has flown that has come, to really influence these elections, that we're getting these extreme policies. And something that I see in Florida and as well as in Texas, and as well as in other places, is a real focus on the public schools. That there's a strategy to both defund public education in order to push it into private school vouchers, but also an attempt to push a particular kind of religion in the public schools. And so we see this in a lot of different policies like content bans and book bans and bans on certain ways that we can teach history, trying to replace a more honest telling of American history with a teaching of America as a Christian nation mythology. Saw that particularly in Florida with a program, a summer teaching program that had civics and history teachers in the state of Florida being trained by a program out of Hillsdale College. I reviewed some of the curriculum for this program, a completely mythologized version of American history that did not mention the separation of church and state, did not mention some of these bedrock ideas, to just really try to rewrite the Constitution and rewrite history in order to fit into this Christian nation frame. A policy that we've seen pushed in both Texas and Florida is also trying to encourage the hiring or accepting as volunteers religious chaplains in public schools, without any kind of regulation about how those chaplains might proselytize to students in public schools and violate religious freedom rights in those ways. So that's the challenging news. The good news, I think, is that going local is actually the best way that we can help stop some of these policies. That a lot of times the policies on the national level, just because of the distance and frankly the dysfunction of Congress right now, we have less and less of an opportunity I mean, we should never stop trying, but we have less of an opportunity to impact policy on the national level. We have a much greater opportunity to impact policy at the state houses, but also at the very local level, the school board level, the ability to keep some of these harmful policies from being implemented. And that's what we've seen. We've seen that happen, for instance, in the chaplain policies, even if they're passed by the legislatures, not actually being implemented in school boards. We're seeing that in Texas as well. There's a new policy that was just passed in this last legislative session. Again, a first of its kind policy in Texas. So I'm kind of warning that this might be coming to Florida or to other states around the country that would set aside a certain period or time of the school day for prayer and Bible reading. And, of course, the problem with this is that religious freedom is already protected in public schools, that kids already have the opportunity to pray and read their sacred texts as long as it doesn't interfere with instruction in other ways. But to set aside a time like this is really rife with problems and possibilities for infringement on religious freedom, particularly when the Attorney General of Texas issued a statement soon after the law took effect that encouraged school boards to pass it and said they should use the time to read the King James Version Bible version of the Lord's Prayer. This is government prescribing religion in ways that harm everyone's religious freedom, including those of the majority religion. And what we've seen in Texas, and again, I'm drawing on my own experience to try to inform what we've seen in other states and could see even more of, are these diverse coalitions, groups of Christians and Jewish groups and secular groups who are coming together to explain to policy members why this harms all of our religious freedom, and that has really had an impact in slowing and in some cases stopping the implementation of these really extreme measures. And so I do think that there are particular opportunities for some of us who are living and working in states that have these very extreme policies to organize, to engage in resistance, and to come up with strategies that can help protect religious freedom and that we can share in other communities to try to stop them from being put into place.
Congressman Jamie Raskin, who's a great champion of separation of church and state, and I presume you've done a lot of work with him. I've seen him quip several times that there will always be prayer in school as long as there are pop math quizzes, but that the issue is when it becomes coercive, right? When it's led by the administration and it's it appears almost a requirement. And there's some comments in the chat about Lifeway schools, about like that they take time during the day either to bring people off campus so it gives the appearance that it's not, the school doing it. There are, groups that are trying to work around it, and then there are other places that are just like flat out trying to get it done in their schools. But increasing the awareness, absolutely. And I love what you're saying about starting on the grassroots. I feel like perhaps progressive movements felt either we were winning or we were focused only on national politics, while this Christian nationalism from the get-go knew that school boards, local elections were the place to start. And that's how and the state houses certainly was a focus before they were able to kind of capture all three branches of our government, as is unfortunately the case right now. So we touched a little bit on the fear really and the danger that Jews may feel about pointing this stuff out and naming it. We are, and I don't know how many folks even in the Jewish community know how few Jews there are in America. We're about 2.5% of all Americans, and yet we're in this kind of weird, unique place in that we're the largest non-Christian faith in America at only 2.5%. So, we've been thinking a lot about what the roles we can play as Jews, like what we might be able to bring to it. But I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about what you might suggest or what you've seen as far as either Jews or other religious minority groups bringing their own perspectives to the conversation.
Yeah, well, I first just want to acknowledge the centuries long work of Jewish activism and advocacy, and that the gains that we've made in this country over, since our founding have not just been given, they've been fought for. And that a lot of that was from advocacy from non-Christians, right? Because even though we have this constitutional promise of religious freedom, we have also had a Christian privilege, and really a Protestant Christian privilege for most of our history. And so I think the Jewish community writ large has already been doing this. And I think what I've seen, particularly on the ground here in Texas, is just incredible activity and fortitude and tenacity from so many different Jewish groups who are coming together to work. And I'll give you some examples of just the power of that. One thing that I've come to see as a real warning sign in any of these policies, particularly that are pushed in the public schools, it's whenever someone leans on saying, well, this is just part of our Judeo-Christian heritage, right? And I think that, I've taken to saying, like, there is no such thing as Judeo-Christianity. That is not a religion. And to use Judeo as just a modifier of Christianity really cheapens both religions, but particularly Judaism. And so to be able to, in your advocacy, to explain, where some of these, again, this window dressing of inclusivity, not to mention the outright exclusivity from anyone who isn't from the Jewish or Christian tradition, but it is just window dressing of inclusivity, particularly to the Jewish religion, and that maybe there's an inclusion of a verse or a story from the Hebrew scriptures, but it's told from a Christian perspective. We saw this, for instance, in Texas, where we were trying to advocate against the adoption of a new curriculum to teach reading and language arts to kids in elementary school. And this curriculum infuses the teaching of Bible stories into the curriculum. And they are overwhelmingly Christian Bible stories. But to the a couple of examples that they do have from the Hebrew scriptures or from what we call the Old Testament, that they were told in ways that were insensitive and often just flat out wrong for what the actual story was. And so we had really impassioned testimony at the State Board of Education from a number of Jewish leaders who were explaining to the State Board of Education, none of whom I believe, as I'm recalling, I don't think any of them were Jewish, but explaining to them how they got the stories wrong. And that was a really important, and in some cases, they actually changed the curriculum based on that testimony. I think that was really powerful. But also, we're seeing, for instance, another push to require the posting of the Ten Commandments in public school classrooms. And again, this is trying to justify it by just being part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. Well, we find that having interfaith coalitions who can explain that while we have different versions of the Ten Commandments in our scriptures, that we understand and interpret them and translate them differently. And for the state to adopt one version, which is, by the way, a edited version of the King James Bible, that is not inclusive of all religious traditions, and to have people of faith from diverse faith backgrounds be able to explain that, I think is a particularly powerful way to engage. So my aim is actually to say, and we say this throughout the campaign, that people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. And so I exhort people to bring their full selves, including their religious identity, if they have one, or their non-religious identity, to bear in their advocacy and to explain why that is the case. I'm just particularly encouraging Christians to take their place in the public square as well, to explain how Christian nationalism harms Christianity as well as other faith traditions. And again, this full sense of belonging.
Yeah, that's so great. And the Ten Commandments, besides the couple of different versions in the actual Torah, religious Jews have 613 commandments.
Right.
Can we get all of those up on the wall? Could it be the
Right.
whole wallpaper? But I really love what you had to say about the phrase Judeo-Christian, and I'm actually putting in the chat right now a link on our website. We actually have a sign-on for folks, and we go into some detail about why that phrase is so problematic. And one of the challenges which you identified is that it feels almost inclusive. And I did get to do some lobbying several years ago with a congressman, not Jamie Raskin, who gets it, but with a congressman who votes the way we would want him to, but still, when I mentioned it, felt like, what's wrong with Judeo-Christian that's inclusive? And so, yeah, obviously, it's not inclusive to atheist, agnostic people or Hindus, Sikh, all other religions outside of that, but also it's used as cover, for example, to discriminate against LGBTQ people. And that was
Mhm.
the example I pointed out. And he seemed to get it, which is that you can claim that because it's in the Hebrew text, one line, and you can interpret it this way, that that's therefore a Judeo-Christian approach. But 85% of American Jews support gay marriage. So it's not
Right.
Judaism. It's not even religious Judaism now is taking different approaches. So we really want to point out that phrase every time it gets used. We want folks who may use it thinking it's inclusive to understand why it's actually exclusive. So I really appreciate that you pointed that out. And I do want to make sure we have time for some Q&A. And I did see that the first one that was entered is a really good question, which is, what is the connection, if there is any, between Christian and white nationalism? So can you talk
Hmm.
a bit about the racial component of what we also many times call white Christian nationalism?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, speaking from the American context, it's very bound up in our history. I mentioned earlier the doctrine of discovery, but also the ways that the Christian scriptures were distorted in order to justify slavery. And so white Christian nationalism both creates and perpetuates a sense of belonging that's limited to the very narrow group of people who held full rights of citizenship at the beginning of the country, which were white Protestant Christian men who owned property. But really, those are the people who held full rights of citizenship, and everyone else, to a different degree, were excluded from being fully American. And because of the ways that Christian nationalism infuses this idea of God's providence on American history, it continues to send a signal that those are only the people who are truly deserving of the full moniker of American. And so it perpetuates and provides cover for white supremacy, that often people will say things like America's a Christian nation, but it's very coded language to also kind of have this idea of whiteness, that the Christian in Christian nationalism is really about an ethno-national identity of whiteness that is in the minds of that has been formed by this ideology for centuries, that is synonymous in their minds with Christianity. And so that's why often we'll see pictures or images of a white Jesus that is used almost like a mascot for this Christian nationalism. And so there are those ways that some subtle, some not so subtle, they continue to send a signal of white supremacy. We've also seen that, of course, with the violence that, whether it be, chants shouted in Charlottesville or manifestos from some of these different perpetrators and killers, that part of their ideology includes some of these really harmful ideologies of the great replacement theory or other ideas that, again, binds up ethnicity and race with a sense of religious identity that is really harmful. And so I often say Christian nationalism. Sometimes I say white Christian nationalism, but I use those terms totally interchangeably because I don't think, and I talk about this a lot in the book, I don't think you can understand Christian nationalism in the US context if you don't also think and work to dismantle racism and white supremacy.
And have you been able to engage some of the Black Christian denominations in the work of Christians against Christian nationalism?
We have, and at BJC, our table of Baptists, we didn't get as much into like what does it mean to be a Baptist because that would be a whole nother webinar. But there's enormous diversity even within the Baptist family, and our table includes a number of the Black Baptist denominations who are, just as committed to these principles of religious freedom and separation of church and state. I found that a lot of the Black Baptist and other Black Christian denominations, they've been working against this ideology of white Christian nationalism for decades and centuries, even though they haven't necessarily been using that terminology. And so I think, again, this is something else I really push in white Christian audiences is how do we learn from these communities who have been working to dismantle this for all of our communities, but also for their very survival for all of these centuries. And so, what do we learn from each other, and how do we learn to follow the lead of these communities and groups that have been doing this hard work?
I saw a question in the Q&A about how this has become sort of a global movement of theocracy in different nations, based upon different religions, etc. Just curious what the question was. What do you think about that? And is that too alarmist?
I don't think so. I think I think as we live through this history, I think there's nothing that's really too alarmist about what we're witnessing right now. And because of the speed that information travels, and that we truly live in a global society, I think what we're seeing, and again, my experience is mostly in the US context, but what we have seen is that American Christian nationalism is both influenced by and is influencing other examples of extremism and religious nationalism around the world. So examples like Viktor Orban's Hungary and the way that that particular version of authoritarianism and how it's mixed up with Christian nationalism has been held up as an example by people here who are trying to further Christian nationalism, really leading us to all-out authoritarian theocracy. That's being put up as an example of where we should head. Even if that means, completely disregarding the principles of the US Constitution. And so we see that how it's being influenced. But I also, and I've actually been interviewed quite a bit by foreign journalists who are trying to understand what American Christian nationalism means and what its impact is on the rest of the world. So I do think we need to have a larger picture of what's happening here, while we go really local to work to dismantle what's happening in our communities. Because again, that's where we're going to have the maximum impact. And our organizing, and I'm talking to organizers here, right? Our organizing on the ground, we're not just trying to resist things. We're trying to build a community that creates flourishing for all of our neighbors, and that we're building relationships in the process. So organizing is not just about the campaign we're waging or the wins we're trying to achieve, but also the community that's built in the process. And so I think it's great to have an understanding of what's happening on the national and the international level while remaining focused on what we can do in our communities.
This is a broad one, but I think it speaks to some of what you started to talk about. How do you address the fact that so many Christian nationalists act in such unchristian ways? So let me kind of massage that question, because you did start talking about kind of the original theology, and I am not in any way a scholar, but I know enough to know that there are quotes like, the odds of a rich man getting into heaven is like a camel through the eye of the needle, right? And yet
Right.
you contrast that with what I, again, don't have a full understanding of, but this kind of prosperity theology that seems so popular, which is basically, it seems to me like if you make a ton of money, it means that God is favoring you. How, and don't they read the same thing? Is there like a different interpretation that I'm not getting, which I would appreciate because Jews interpret lots of the same sentences in vastly different ways as well. Is this just a theological debate or a real twisting of what it really means?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one can interpret and pull out of context and distort scripture to say and stand for basically anything we want it to stand for. Like I think that is the challenge. And so I think understanding the holistic idea of what the Christian religion is about. And that's why, and not to be too simplistic, because I think it is also an incredibly nuanced and challenging religion. But if I had to sum up Christianity in one word, it's love. That Jesus's central commandment was to love God, and a second one like it, to love our neighbors as ourselves. And if I had to sum up Christian nationalism in one word, it's power. And that it's a form of idolatry as well, that it seeks us to worship power over the commandments that Jesus interpreted for us, the God's commandments that Jesus interpreted, which is to love. Also look at the totality of Jesus's life, death, and resurrection, which was about always being on the side of the marginalized and the oppressed, about turning our conceptions of earthly power on its head. Last shall be first, and the first shall be last. Some of the other scriptures that you just cited, like that, it really challenged us to think about God's will for the world being so much better and higher than what empire would try to give us. And in fact, Jesus was killed by the empire for speaking truth to power. And so that example is as far as I can think from what the example of again the white Jesus, that's the mascot for Christian nationalism, would try to tell us. And so inherent in the question was the term Christian nationalist, and here's my nuance on how I think about it. I really don't label anyone as a Christian nationalist. I talk about Christian nationalism as an ideology. And it is something that each one of us, no matter of our religious identity or any other identity that we have, each one of us has an opportunity to reject or embrace it almost on a daily basis. And that it's not an immutable characteristic. It's not something that we're born with and we can't do anything about. It's a choice that we make. And so I find also that if by using the word as a label for someone, that we create distance between ourselves and it, and it prevents us in many ways in really interrogating and seeing how we might have unwittingly embraced Christian nationalism ourselves. And so I think, especially for Christian communities, I challenge us all to think about, where have we, worshiped power over love? Where have we drawn ourselves away from the teachings of Jesus? How can we, in the kind of Christian language, become better disciples of Jesus, and learn to reject Christian nationalism? And that gives us all a piece of both complicity, but also agency to do something about it.
I love that approach because we can think in the same way about racism and
Exactly.
that we're all struggling to overcome racism and we don't all have to call each other racists to help each other overcome racism. So I really love that parallel as well. Laura, do you see another quick question?
You spoke a little bit about speaking to lawmakers and clarifying Judeo-Christian, et cetera, some of those. And I understand that you've testified before Congress. Is there anything else you would elaborate about our best way to communicate with our lawmakers?
Yeah, well, yes, I have had the opportunity to testify and twice at the invitation of Representative Jamie Raskin, who has been, just an incredible lawmaker and leader in Congress, but also a very brave voice on calling out Christian nationalism. And the first time I was invited to testify, it was just a few weeks after the January 6th commission issued its or special committee, select committee issued its report. And even though the committee had sought testimony about Christian nationalism, it did not mention Christian nationalism in its report as a cause or even as a factor in the insurrection on January 6th. And that was a real wake up call for me and for our movement that we needed to be louder at calling out Christian nationalism, particularly as Christians, because our elected representatives needed to hear it from the people first, that for a variety of reasons, and Representative Raskin is the exception. He was willing to call it out, but his colleagues on both sides of the aisle were too afraid to name Christian nationalism because they thought they would be attacked for being against Christianity. And so I think it's really important for those of us to bring this as an issue to our lawmakers. I found that in both times that I testified, you're sitting there, you see all of the lawmakers from both parties. They were really listening, when I was testifying and curious and why is this Christian woman who's also an attorney who is coming, like, why is she making this her cause? And I think so my advice is, one, to speak from a place of authenticity, from our own experience, from our own perspective, but to speak out. That our silence is doing us no favors, and that our elected officials need to get bravery to speak on this issue and really permission to speak on this issue from hearing it from constituents.
Well, I think I can only speak for myself, but I believe many of my fellow Jewish Americans are so appreciative of the work that you're doing. It's so important. How can folks follow along with your work?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I appreciate those words. And yes, you can find out much more about our movement at bjconline.org. That's the website of Baptist Joint Committee. We also have a website for Christians Against Christian Nationalism.org. We are on social media at BJC on the Hill and at End Christian Nationalism. And can also support by checking out the book and sharing it with people in your communities, How to End Christian Nationalism.
And these are all nonprofits, by the way. And in case you
Yes.
haven't gotten 400 emails today, it's Giving Tuesday. So, jfasd.org is also accepting donations. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. This was fascinating. And obviously, we wish you much success in the goals that you've set.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Amanda. We
And
really
thank you for
appreciate
your
it.
partnership. Yeah.
Thank
Sure, of
you.
course. Take care. Thanks, everybody. Bye bye.